Imagine this. You're just going about your day when suddenly a police officer, someone sworn to protect the public, pulls out a gun and points it directly at you. But this isn't just any ordinary person. It's the wife of the FBI director. Now picture this. The officer is not just facing the consequences of a bad decision, but a dramatic, swift downfall that no one could have predicted. What happens when someone in law enforcement crosses the line, not just in their duties, but in their actions toward a high-profile individual? In this video, we're diving into a shocking incident that unfolds in mere minutes, one that escalates quickly and leads to a dramatic firing. What happens when the law itself gets tested by someone in power? And what consequences follow? Stay with us to the end. It all began during a seemingly routine traffic stop in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The FBI director's wife, who was driving home from a meeting, had no idea that her day was about to take a dangerous turn. As she was pulling over after being flagged by a police officer, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The officer, who had pulled her over for what was reported as a minor traffic violation, approached her vehicle. At first, it appeared to be just another typical interaction between law enforcement and a civilian. But something about this encounter was different. The officer, who was later revealed to have a history of questionable behavior, began to escalate the situation almost immediately. As the FBI director's wife, calm and collected, followed standard procedure, handing over her ID and registration, the officer's demeanor changed. His tone became more aggressive. Witnesses reported that the officer began asking strange, racially charged questions, demanding unnecessary details and showing clear signs of frustration. There was no real reason for the officer to be so aggressive, especially considering the minor nature of the infraction. It wasn't long before the officer's behavior took an even more alarming turn. Without provocation, he pulled his gun and pointed it at her. For a moment, there was confusion. Why was this escalation happening over such a routine stop? Was it a misunderstanding? Was it something more sinister? The officer's actions were shocking not only because of their intensity, but because of the blatant display of unprofessionalism and racism. It was clear from the officer's body language and words that he viewed the situation through a lens of prejudice. His actions suggested that his judgment was clouded by racial bias, turning an ordinary traffic stop into a life-threatening encounter. Despite the gravity of the situation, the FBI director's wife, remarkably, remained calm. She kept her hands visible, speaking softly and attempting to de-escalate the situation. Even as the gun was pointed at her, she did not panic. Her experience and composure under pressure were evident, as she slowly explained who she was. At no point did she make any sudden movements or respond aggressively, understanding that any misstep could have deadly consequences. She maintained a level-headed, strategic approach, which likely prevented the situation from escalating further. But in the background, her mind must have been racing, knowing she was in a life-or-death moment, yet somehow managing to keep control of her emotions. As soon as the incident unfolded, it didn't take long for authorities to recognize the severity of the officer's actions. The FBI director's wife was a high-profile individual, and her account of the confrontation was taken seriously by law enforcement immediately. The officer's behavior was not going to be overlooked. What followed was a rapid chain of events. Witnesses, who were nearby during the traffic stop, quickly came forward. Some had recorded parts of the interaction on their phones, capturing the officer's aggression and the unsettling moment when he drew his weapon. The video evidence would prove to be damning, showing not just the inappropriate escalation, but also the officer's clear racial bias. This wasn't just a matter of a miscommunication or an isolated incident. This was an officer abusing his power and endangering a life. As the footage circulated and witnesses gave their statements, it became clear that the officer's actions were indefensible. His behavior, unprovoked and reckless, left the department with little room to defend him. The police department was swift in its response. Within hours of the incident, an internal investigation was launched, and the officer was placed on administrative leave pending review. The speed of the department's reaction caught many by surprise. Typically, investigations into police conduct can drag on, but this situation was different. The nature of the incident, coupled with the potential fallout if it wasn't handled properly, made it a top priority. The presence of video footage and eyewitness testimonies meant there was no ambiguity about what had occurred. The officers' actions were clear, and the department knew they had no choice but to act swiftly. It wasn't long before the decision was made. Within minutes of the incident, the officer was officially dismissed. The swift firing sent a strong message. The department would not tolerate such behavior, especially when it involved racial bias and an unjustified display of force. The immediate dismissal underscored the seriousness with which law enforcement viewed the officer's actions. In a matter of hours, a career was ruined, showing that misconduct, even from those in power, would not be ignored. The public's reaction to the incident was swift and overwhelmingly critical. Social media erupted with condemnation as the video of the encounter began circulating. People from all walks of life expressed their outrage over the officer's actions, with many pointing out the blatant racial bias that seemed to fuel his aggression. The fact that the victim was the FBI director's wife only heightened the shock, making the situation even more high-profile. There was little defense for the officer's actions. Some voices did attempt to downplay the situation, arguing that the officer might have been under stress or misjudged the situation, but these voices were quickly drowned out by the majority calling for accountability. The widespread outcry focused on the officer's unprofessionalism and the underlying racism that many believed influenced his decision to escalate the encounter so unnecessarily. As the public and media expressed their outrage, law enforcement agencies had to respond. The police department where the officer served issued a public statement almost immediately after his firing. The statement was clear and direct. The department had a zero-tolerance policy for any form of racial bias, misconduct, or abuse of power. They emphasized that the actions of the officer were not in line with the values the department was supposed to uphold. The message was unequivocal. Such behavior would not be accepted under any circumstances. The FBI, which was directly impacted by the incident due to the victim's identity, also made a public statement. The FBI's response mirrored that of the police department, with an emphasis on the importance of integrity and professionalism within law enforcement. They reaffirmed their commitment to fighting systemic racism and ensuring that all law enforcement officers were held to the highest standards. The FBI made it clear that any officer, regardless of rank or position, would face consequences for racial discrimination and misconduct. Both statements from the local police department and the FBI reinforced the message that accountability and transparency were essential in law enforcement, especially when it came to matters of racism and excessive use of force. While this incident certainly shocked many, it is far from an isolated occurrence. The officer's behavior, rooted in racial bias, points to a much larger ongoing issue within law enforcement: systemic racism. Time and again, we've seen how prejudice can manifest in policing, whether through racial profiling, excessive force, or discriminatory practices. This incident serves as a reminder that racism isn't just an individual failing, it's embedded in the very structures of some police forces. Statistics paint a stark picture. Studies show that Black Americans are disproportionately targeted by police in routine traffic stops, with Black drivers being more likely to be pulled over, searched, and subjected to forceful interactions. According to a 2020 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, Black drivers are 20% more likely to be pulled over than white drivers, and once stopped, they are more likely to be searched, even though they are less likely to be carrying contraband. These numbers underscore a troubling reality. Racial bias exists in police encounters across the country, often putting people of color at a distinct disadvantage. The officer's actions in this case, while extreme, reflect the broader trend of racial discrimination that persists in law enforcement. It's not just about one rogue cop. This is part of a systemic problem that continues to affect communities, especially Black and brown individuals. The lack of accountability for such behavior in the past has only fueled distrust between police and the communities they serve. So when an incident like this occurs, it's impossible to ignore the larger context that enables such behavior to persist. The decision to swiftly fire the officer was a crucial step in the right direction. It demonstrated that accountability can be enforced, even at the highest levels of law enforcement. When an officer is caught engaging in misconduct, especially behavior driven by racism, prompt action shows that law enforcement agencies can and will take the necessary steps to protect the public and ensure justice. But while the swift firing in this case is a positive example, It shouldn't be seen as the solution to the problem as a whole. True change requires more than just reacting to individual incidents. It demands long-term efforts to reform police training, improve community relations, and address the root causes of racial bias within the system. Holding officers accountable is critical, but tackling systemic racism within the institutions themselves requires continuous work. Policies that prevent discrimination, better oversight, and most importantly, a commitment to changing the culture of policing. This incident may have been a step toward justice, but it also highlights the immense challenges that remain in eradicating racism from law enforcement. This incident serves as a stark reminder of the power and responsibility law enforcement holds, and the consequences when that power is abused. The officer's actions, fueled by racial bias and aggression, crossed a line that no one in law enforcement should ever be allowed to cross. But what stands out in this case is that, unlike so many others, the officer was held accountable swiftly and decisively. The firing of this officer wasn't just about one person being punished. It was about sending a message that misconduct, especially when it involves racial discrimination, will not be tolerated. It's also a reminder of how crucial transparency and accountability are in policing. Without these principles, trust between the public and law enforcement continues to erode. When law enforcement agencies are open about their actions and hold officers accountable for misconduct, it helps restore some of that trust. The firing in this case demonstrates the importance of immediate action when police officers violate their duties, but it's just one example of how we need broader reforms to ensure fair and just policing in every community. We want to hear from you. What do you think should be done to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future? How can we push for stronger accountability and more transparent systems in law enforcement? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective.